He is now being told that he can have the hood, but he refused that. He went to the rope, seeing that noose before him.
December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein stared death right in the face as cell phones recorded his final moments. Later, millions watched as the dictator's end was broadcast to the world. Here are some dictators who got executed on live TV. December 25th, 1989. While most of the world is exchanging gifts and gathering around a dinner table, a different kind of history is unfolding behind the cold concrete walls of a military base in Romania. Now that afternoon, cameras rolled as the country's most feared man, Nicolae Ceausescu, along with his wife Elena, was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad. Now the footage wasn't broadcast live, but within days, most of the world had seen it, and for Romanians, it marked a brutal end of an era. But how did it come to this? Just a few days earlier, Ceausescu had still been clinging to power. For 24 years, he ruled Romania with an iron grip, crushing dissent through one of the most feared secret police networks in the world. He built lavish palaces while his people didn't have bread. Electricity was rationed, food was scarce, and fear was a constant among the Romanian people. By December 1989, something cracked. It started in the western city of Timișoara, where protests against the regime were met with bullets. But this time, the violence didn't work. The anger spread like wildfire, first to the capital, Bucharest, then across the entire country. Within days, hundreds of thousands filled the streets, chanting,
"Down with Ceausescu."
Then came December 22nd. Protesters stormed the Communist Party HQ in Bucharest. Ceausescu and Elena fled by helicopter. They knew it was over. The revolution was no longer a whisper. It was roaring. Not only that, but people were calling for their heads. And this escape didn't last long. Just 50 kilometers outside the capital, they're stopped and arrested by soldiers. For the next 3 days, Nicolae and Elena were held inside a cold military base in Targovste, cut off from the world, while the country they once controlled burned with anger and unrest outside. Inside the barracks, decisions were being made fast. Romania's new leaders, the National Salvation Front, didn't just want the Ceausescus out of power, they wanted them gone for good. As some argued for a proper trial, others were convinced time was running out. What if their loyalists came to rescue them, right? What if chaos spiraled further as the people were demanding action? So on Christmas Eve, a coded message was sent by Victor Stanculescu, who was Ceausescu's last defense minister before joining the revolution. The message was,
"Recourse to the method."
But it wasn't just a phrase, it was a death sentence. By the next morning, a makeshift panel had been pulled together to hold what could only be called a kangaroo trial. The courtroom was just this small freezing room inside a military base, and while the trial hadn't even begun, everyone knew how it was going to end. Of course, Ceausescu himself didn't recognize the court. He called the whole thing illegal and accused his captors of staging a Soviet coup. Elena refused to cooperate as well. Their state-appointed lawyer had only minutes to prepare, and when he suggested pleading insanity to delay execution, Elena lashed out in rage. The lawyer later said,
"When I suggested it, Elena in particular said it was an outrageous setup. They felt deeply insulted. They rejected my help after that."
The couple's charges were genocide, economic sabotage, destroying public property, and fleeing the country with billions in stolen funds. The evidence was barely mentioned, and the trial lasted less than an hour. By 2:50 p.m., the couple's dragged out into the biting December cold. Their hands are tied and their fate is sealed. Nicolae lashes out,
"I could have been shot without this masquerade."
while Elena thrashed and cursed at the soldiers, yelling,
"Don't tie us up, you bastards!"
In his final moments, Ceausescu started chanting a defiant verse of the Internationale, the old communist anthem. His voice, however, was cut short by the gunfire that burst into him. The execution was so sudden that the cameras almost missed it. The firing squad, made up of 8 paratroopers, opened fire before the crew was ready. Only the last bursts were caught on tape. What the world saw wasn't polished. It was shaky, raw, unsettling. But in this grainy footage, people saw the collapse of decades of fear and dictatorship. They saw 2 once powerful figures turned powerless in an instant. The Ceausescu's bodies were buried quickly, but they were exhumed years later for identification. Their graves still draw visitors, some to mourn, others to remember. And while Romanians felt relief that day, the execution would spark questions that still echo today. Was justice truly served? Or was it revenge disguised as due process? Even the chief judge, General Gica Popa, who delivered the death sentence, reportedly couldn't live with what happened. A year later, he's found dead after taking his own life. It's April 22, 1945, a road near Lake Como. We have Italy's former fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, standing face to face with the end of his reign and his life. And just days earlier, Mussolini was still chasing the illusion of escape. He's wrapped in a stolen Luftwaffe coat, hiding amongst retreating German soldiers, hoping to slip across the Swiss border without being noticed. But how do you hide a face that was once stared down from every street corner in Italy? The partisans, Italy's resistance fighters, recognized him almost immediately. And once they did, there was no slipping away. Mussolini had ruled Italy with flair and force since 1922, calling himself Il Duce, the leader, building a regime powered by fear, propaganda, and a cult-like devotion. He spoke of reviving the glory of ancient Rome, but what he delivered was far from it. Ruin, war, and repression. At home, he silenced every form of opposition, and abroad, he sided with Hitler and dragged Italy deeper into the chaos of World War II. However, by 1945, the dream was dead. The Allies are marching north through Italy, and his so-called Italian Social Republic, a Nazi-backed puppet state, was collapsing. On April 25th, Mussolini and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, fled Milan in a convoy of loyalists. The plan was simple: cross into Switzerland and leave the war and justice behind. Instead, they're stopped by communist partisans near the village of Dongo. At first, the fighters didn't realize who they had, as Mussolini had tried to blend in with the Germans. But one good look at his face and there was no doubt. The man who once ruled Italy by force was now a prisoner, slumped in the back of a truck. April 28th, the verdict came, quick and final. Acting on orders from resistance leaders, the partisans drove Mussolini and Petacci to the quiet village of Quilino di Misegra. It was quiet, no crowds, no chaos, just a narrow road and a stone wall of a villa. That's where they told the couple to get out. We had no courtroom, no trial, no defense, just a few sharp words, a raised weapon, and a burst of gunfire. Mussolini's last recorded words were reportedly,
"Aim at my heart."
Petacci screamed and clung to him until the very end. Their bodies hit the ground, bloody, lifeless, and stripped of all ceremony. That night, their corpses and those of several other fascist leaders were tossed into the back of a truck and hauled off to Milan. At Piazzale Loreto, the square where fascists had once displayed the bodies of murdered partisans, the tables were turned. A crowd had already gathered by morning. They spat, kicked, and cursed at the corpses. One woman fired bullets into Mussolini's body, shouting,
"For my 5 sons!"
Then, in one of the most infamous images of the 20th century, Mussolini and Petacci are hanged upside down by their ankles from a metal girder above a gas station. The message was clear, as brutal as it was. This was the end of fascism in Italy. The Allies had arrived in Milan hours later and ordered the bodies taken down. A post-mortem followed. Mussolini had been hit with a lot of bullets. Some say 7, others 9. Samples of his brain were sent off to the US to see if madness explained his actions, but nothing came out of it. Now, believe it or not, Mussolini's story doesn't end in his grave. The body's buried in secret, and yet it was stolen in 1946 by fascist supporters. It was hidden in a monastery and then moved around for years. It wasn't until 1957, over a decade later, that his remains were quietly returned to his hometown of Predapio. Today, his tomb is still visited by neo-fascist sympathizers.
Assassin's bullets put a bloody end to the 31-year dictatorship of Dominican strongman Rafael Trujillo, here with his brother Hector. His was one of the most absolute iron-fisted rules in modern history.
We go to May 30th, 1961. Now that night, the rain hadn't started yet. The road outside Santo Domingo was quiet. Too quiet. Rafael Trujillo, known across the Dominican Republic as El Jefe, was on his way to visit his young mistress. Now for him, this is just another trip down the highway. But this guy had no idea it would be his last. Trujillo had ruled the country for over 30 years. Some of his supporters called it order. Others, however, knew it as hell. But no one dared to say that out loud. Under his grip, opposition didn't just disappear. It was wiped off the map through torture, executions, and people vanishing overnight. He built a country in his own image, even renamed the capital Ciudad Trujillo, and stamped God and Trujillo on churches, buildings, even license plates. Subtlety, sure, wasn't his thing. Trujillo built a cult of personality so massive it swallowed the entire country. Streets, bridges, schools, even mountains carried his name. Meanwhile, those who dared to speak out faced the brutal consequences. But by the late 1950s, even Trujillo's fear tactics couldn't keep the storm at bay. He had ordered the murder of the Mirabal sisters, 3 activists whose deaths shocked the nation. And then came the whispers demanding change. Inside the Dominican Republic, a group of men, general, businessmen, even members of his own inner circle, decided enough was enough. But toppling El Jefe wasn't something they could just pull off alone. They needed some help, and that help came, quietly, from the United States. By the late 50s, Trujillo had become a liability. This guy was reckless, violent, unpredictable. He even tried assassinating Venezuela's president with a car bomb in broad daylight. Well, that crossed a line, and the US, never shy about getting involved during the Cold War, decided it was time for him to go. The CIA didn't pull the trigger, but they didn't exactly walk away either. They made sure that the plotters had what they needed. 3 American M1 carbines were conveniently forgotten at the US consulate, basically a wink in weapon form. So on the night of May 30th, 1961, Trujillo's shiny Chevy was ambushed on a dark road. The conspirators opened fire with the same American M1 carbines. Bullets tore through his car as the dictator tried to fight back, but it was no use. This guy was hit and still manages to step out of the vehicle alive until one final shot from a carbine dropped him cold on the side of the road. That moment, the end of El Jefe, wasn't just an assassination. In the Dominican Republic, they called it ajusticiamiento, pretty much saying justice served. But that justice came at a cost. The conspirators didn't get away clean. They were hunted down by Trujillo's loyalists, tortured, and executed in brutal reprisals. Only 2 survived because they were hidden by foreign diplomats. The rest became martyrs, remembered by the people, not as traitors, but as heroes. And what about Trujillo's legacy? Well, his family had fled the country. The capital's name was changed back, statues were pulled down, and the scars he left took generations to fade. We go to September 9th, 1990. It was supposed to be a peace meeting. President Samuel Canyon Doe, ruler of Liberia for a ruthless 10 years, arrived at the ECOMOG Peacekeeping HQ in Monrovia with just a handful of guards. He came without warning, hoping, some say begging, for safe passage. But what happened next would become one of the most disturbing moments ever captured on camera. Now, Doe wasn't always the president. In 1980, he was just a 28-year-old master sergeant when he stormed into the executive mansion and gunned down Liberia's then president, William Tolbert. 13 of Tolbert's cabinet members were marched to the beach and executed by firing squad. There was no trail. Being on the losing side was enough. To many, Doe's coup was the end of a corrupt Americo-Liberian elite, descendants of freed African-American slaves who had ruled the country like a private club since its founding. Now, for the first time, native Liberians saw one of their own in power, but that celebration didn't last long. Over the next 10 years, Doe ruled with fear and violence. He silenced critics, rigged elections, and gave top government jobs to people from his own ethnic group, the Kron. Meanwhile, other communities, especially the Gio and Mano tribes, were pushed aside, targeted, and even killed. After a failed coup attempt in 1985, Doe cracked down even harder. But from that moment, it was clear the country was on a road to civil war. In late 1989, a warlord named Charles Taylor launched a rebellion from across the border in the Ivory Coast, and soon invaded Liberia. Just like that, Liberia spirals into total chaos. Villages are burnt to the ground, innocent people were slaughtered, and deep-rooted tribal tensions erupted like never before. But here's the thing, as the country bled, the world mostly turned its back. That's when Prince Johnson stepped into the chaos. Once a close ally of Charles Taylor, Johnson had broken away to lead his own faction. He's even more ruthless, theatrical even, and very unpredictable. And while the two men had once fought side by side, Johnson now wanted control for himself, especially over Monrovia, Liberia's capital. At the time, Monrovia was the final prize. The rest of the country was already in flames, but whoever took the capital would likely control the government, or what was left of it. And Samuel Doe, held up in the city, was still clinging to power. Then came September 9th, 1990. Doe gets to the HQ of a West African peacekeeping force, thinking this is neutral ground. But outside, his bodyguards were kept waiting. Inside, Prince Johnson's men were already lying in wait. Gunfire broke out. Doe was shot in the leg, captured, and dragged away. What followed wasn't just an execution, but a brutal spectacle. Johnson had the entire ordeal filmed, over 12 hours of taunting, mocking, and cruelty. As Doe bled from his wounds, Johnson sat beside him, calmly sipping a beer, even cracking jokes. The cameras kept rolling as Doe was tortured, mutilated, and ultimately killed. Later, the footage aired on national television, not as a warning, but as a twisted symbol of victory. And just like that, by the end of the night, Liberia's once untouchable president was gone. Shaved, bald, riddled with wounds, and his body dumped in the streets. A man who had ruled by fear, now brought down by even greater violence. But did his death bring peace? Oh, not even close. Instead, Liberia sank deeper into chaos. The power vacuum Doe left behind only fueled the fire. Warlords battled for control, communities were shattered, and the killing didn't stop. It escalated to unprecedented levels, opening the gates to a bloodier chapter, one that would haunt Liberia for years to come.
This is a Libya that for the first time in 42 years does not have to live in fear of Muammar Gaddafi. He is gone for good.
October 20th, 2011. Just past noon, when they dragged this guy out of a drain in Sirte, Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, the man who once called himself the brotherly leader, the guide of the revolution, and even the king of kings of Africa, was now on his knees, in the dirt, bloodied, dazed, and barely alive. Rebel fighters surrounded him, some hitting him, others filming with their phones, and he's begging for his life, asking,
"What did I do to you?"
Then came the gunshot, then another. And just like that, after 42 years in power, Libya's dictator was dead. But to understand how it came to this, how one of the most dramatic and feared rulers in the world ended up dying in a ditch, you gotta go back. We're at 1969, Gaddafi's 27 years old, and he stages a bloodless coup. He was just a junior officer in the Libyan army, yet he managed to overthrow King Idris, while the monarch was out of the country receiving medical treatment. With hardly a shot fired, Gaddafi declared a new era, a Libyan Arab Republic based on pan-Arabism, socialism, and his own unique vision of revolution. At first, many people welcomed the change. Libya, rich in oil but poor in freedom, seemed ready for something different. And well, Gaddafi promised to use the country's vast oil wealth to improve lives. Now, for a while, some of that actually happened. We had free education, free healthcare, and new infrastructure. But it didn't take long for the dream to turn into something darker. He started banning political parties, Dissidents were arrested, tortured, or simply disappeared. Public executions were televised, and even speaking out could get you jailed or worse. He ruled through fear, with a secret police force that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. Now, while most Libyans lived in poverty, Gaddafi surrounded himself with golden thrones, luxurious Bedouin-style tents flown around the world, and female bodyguards in military uniforms. His ego knew no limits. He would rename the months of the calendar after himself and declare that his writings, the Green Book, would replace all political ideologies. Now, outside of Libya, he was even more unpredictable. He funded groups across the globe, from the IRA in Ireland to militant factions in the Philippines. He was also accused of orchestrating the 1986 Berlin discotheque bombing that killed American soldiers, and most infamously, the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people. In response, the U.S. bombed his compound in Tripoli in 1986. He survived and used it to boost his image as a defiant hero, resisting the West. But by the early 2000s, isolated and under international sanctions, Gaddafi started to change course. He gave up his nuclear weapons program, tried to warm relations with the West, and opened Libya up to foreign investment. And for a brief time, the world seemed to forget his past. Until 2011. That year, the Arab Spring swept through the Middle East and North Africa like wildfire. In Tunisia and Egypt, dictators fell within weeks. When protests erupted in Libya, Gaddafi responded the only way he knew how: by force. He sent tanks into the street, ordered snipers to fire on crowds, and declared he would purify Libya.
وسنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر. بيت بيت. دار دار. زنقة زنقة. فرد فرد.
But this time, the people didn't back down. What began as demonstrations now turned into armed uprisings, splitting cities between rebels and regime loyalists. And soon, the world took notice. In March 2011, the UN approved a no-fly zone, and NATO began bombing Gaddafi's military targets, helping rebels gain ground. One by one, Libyan cities fell, and in August, Tripoli, the capital, slipped from his grasp. But Gaddafi had vanished. For weeks, he was nowhere. Some said he fled to the desert. Others believed he was already dead. But in truth, he'd retreated to Sirte, his coastal hometown, trying to make a final stand. By October, Sirte was surrounded. The rebels were closing in, and Gaddafi made one last attempt to escape. October 20th, Gaddafi, along with his guards and close advisors, tried to flee the city in a convoy of vehicles. But NATO drones were watching. A French fighter jet struck the convoy with a missile. Several vehicles exploded, and bodies flew on the ground. Wounded but alive, Gaddafi crawls from one of the vehicles and takes shelter in a roadside drainage pipe. It was filthy, forgotten, and exactly the kind of place a man like him never imagined he would end up. Hours later, rebel fighters swept the area. They found him there, crouched in the dark. What followed was absolute chaos. The footage was grainy, filmed on phones, but it showed Gaddafi pulled out by the mob, bleeding from his head, crying out in pain and confusion. Some men shouted for his life to be spared. Others would beat him with their shoes, fists, and a pistol. He pled with them.
Don't shoot.
But then a gun was raised, and it was over. His body's loaded into a truck and driven away. For days, it was kept in a meat locker in the city of Misrata. Libyans lined up to see it with their own eyes. Many wept, some laughed, and some just stared into silence at a man who terrorized them for decades. But Libya's nightmare wasn't over. Without Gaddafi now, the country collapses. Rival militias seize power, weapons flood the streets, turning the country into a fractured battlefield. In the chaos, we had extremist groups like ISIS finding room to grow. They grabbed territory and added even more bloodshed to an already broken country. Today, Libya remains divided. So yeah, Gaddafi might be gone, but the wounds he left behind are still wide open.
Saddam, as we said, dressed in this raincoat, black suit, with his feet and hands tied, being taken from the execution room to the gallows.
Welcome to December 30th, 2006, early morning in Baghdad, Iraq, when Saddam Hussein, once the most feared man in the country, was led into this small, dimly lit room. hands tied behind his back. The walls were bare concrete, and a noose hung from the ceiling. The people in the room weren't just witnesses. They were his enemies, men from the new Iraqi government, many of them members of the Shia majority Saddam had brutally oppressed for decades. Some stood quietly watching, while others chanted the name of another leader Saddam had once tried to crush. He had a dark coat over a white shirt. He looked older, grayer, but calm, even refusing the hood. And as the chants grew louder, he began to recite a prayer. Then the trapdoor opened beneath him, and just like that, Saddam was dead, and the whole world saw it. Someone had filmed the execution on a shaky cell phone, and within hours the video's online. You can hear the taunts, the shouts, and the exact moment his body fell. But to really understand why this moment mattered so much, why it was so shocking, even to those who hated him, you need to know what came before it. April 28, 1937, Saddam Hussein's story began in Tikrit, a small city north of Baghdad. He's born into poverty, raised by a brutal stepfather, and shaped by violence from the start. He joined the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that wanted to unite Arab countries under one powerful secular government. He quickly rises through the ranks, not through his charm, but through sheer ruthlessness. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party took over Iraq, and by 1979, Saddam made himself president. One of his first acts in power was unforgettable and terrifying. He calls a party meeting. Everyone shows up, smiling, and then one by one, he began reading the names of his traitors, as he claimed. The room froze as these men were dragged out, begging for mercy. Later, they're all executed. Well, that message was crystal clear. Iraq didn't belong to its people anymore. It belonged to him. Now, he made sure his face was everywhere, on buildings, in schools, and in people's homes. He created a personality cult, making himself out to be a hero, a savior, almost a god. And of course, behind that image was absolute fear. He'd built a secret police force that watched everything and everyone. If you spoke out, you'd disappear. Simple as that. And so people learned to stay silent, because in Saddam's Iraq, even a whisper can get you killed. Then Saddam spiraled even further. 1980, he launches a brutal war against neighboring Iran, hoping to grab oil-rich land and prove his strength. It was supposed to be quick, but instead it drags on for 8 bloody years. And there's no clear winner here, just devastation with over 1 million people killed. That wasn't a regular war. Saddam had used chemical weapons on Iranian soldiers and even his own people. In 1988, he attacked the Kurdish town of Halabja, killing thousands of civilians in one of the worst chemical massacres in history. And even after that war ended in a draw, Saddam still wasn't done. In 1990, he invaded Kuwait, another oil-rich neighbor, hoping to boost Iraq's failing economy. But this time, the world fought back. The US led a massive coalition joined by countries like the UK and Saudi Arabia and pushed Saddam's forces out of Kuwait in just 6 weeks. This is the Gulf War. In the aftermath, Iraq's military was shattered, but Saddam still held on to power, and he used it with terrifying force. Now, after the war, uprisings broke out, first in the south by Shia Muslims, then in the north by the Kurds. Saddam's response was merciless. He sent in tanks, dropped bombs, and once again turned to chemical weapons. Thousands were killed, entire towns were flattened, and many more fled to neighboring countries as refugees. Then came 2001. The September 11th terrorist attack shook the world and changed everything. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The US, in shock and grief, shifted into war mode. President George W. Bush launches what he calls the War on Terror. And even though Saddam Hussein had no proven link to the attacks or to even Al-Qaeda, he was quickly put on Washington's radar. The US would accuse him of secretly stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, and painted him as this ticking time bomb in an already unstable region. Oh, the US looked for that evidence. They sent in all kinds of inspectors. But here's the thing. No weapons were ever found. Still, the Bush administration wanted Saddam removed. So, in March 2003, the US launches a full-scale invasion of Iraq. Within weeks, Baghdad fell. Saddam's portraits are torn down, his palaces looted, and his army scattered. The regime crumbled almost overnight. Iraq was just left in ruins, and Saddam was nowhere to be found. Until December 13th, 2003, after months in hiding, U.S. troops finally found Saddam holed up in a small, filthy underground hideout near his hometown of Tikrit. The once powerful dictator surrendered without a fight. After his capture, Saddam was handed over to the new Iraqi government. The U.S. helped set up a court to put him on trial for his several crimes. But it was a controversial process, with many questioning whether it was truly fair or even politically motivated. He's eventually convicted of crimes against humanity for the 1982 massacre in the town of Dujal, where 148 men and boys were killed in retaliation for the assassination attempt on Saddam. The court sentenced him to death by hanging. December 30th, 2006. It's the first day of Eid al-Adha, a sacred Muslim holiday meant to honor sacrifice, family, and forgiveness. But that morning in Baghdad, something different was happening. Saddam Hussein was about to be executed. Now, the execution was meant to be quiet and controlled. It wasn't. Instead, a shaky cell phone video captured secretly by someone in this room leaked within hours. The world saw it all. Saddam standing on the gallows, surrounded by masked men who mocked him, cursed him, and shouted the name of a rival leader. Most of them were Shias, the group that had suffered under Saddam's regime the most. The global reaction was deeply divided. In parts of Iraq and Iran, people celebrated in the streets. In other countries and many human rights circles, the execution was condemned. Critics called this a rushed spectacle, more about revenge than justice. They pointed to the timing on Eid al-Adha and questioned what message that sent. Also, they feel that his death would fuel even more sectarian violence. They were right. Man, Saddam's hanging did not bring peace. If anything, it just opened the floodgates. Sunni insurgents, Shia militias, Kurdish forces, they all wanted power, dragging Iraq into a brutal fight for control. And as U.S. troops began to withdraw, a dangerous vacuum was left behind. And that gave rise to something even worse: ISIS. Thank you, U.S. The extremist group fed off the chaos, seizing towns, spreading fear, and plunging Iraq into even deeper darkness. So, for the poor Iraqi people, Saddam's death didn't mark the end of any violence. It just reshaped it. Years of dictatorship, followed by war and foreign occupation, had already left deep scars, ones that never healed. And even now, Iraq is still living with the consequences, still grappling with the wounds left behind by Saddam's regime, and by everything that came after.